Usually, when you turn 12 or 13, your parents give you the talk. I'd heard about this birds and the bees talk since I was a kid, mostly from other kids who had already had the talk. However, when it was my turn to have this talk, it didn't just focus on the birds and the bees like I expected. Instead, my parents felt the need to have a different kind of talk, the one I've henceforth titled the Black Talk. While the birds and the bees section of the talk was short and simple, here's what sex is, here's the consequences, don't do it, etc., the black section of the talk was very different and much harder to understand, at least as a 12-year-old. What made it harder for me, and by proxy my parents turned lecturers, was the fact that within that talk they had to have two different types of conversations. While my dad focused on the black aspect of the talk, my mom focused on the woman aspect of the talk. Now, I know I say the talk like it's this big, intimidating subject to fear, and that's because this talk was just that and more to me at the time. This talk wasn't just about sex, it was also about my place in the world, or at least America, as a black woman. My parents felt that they had to prepare me for the harsh realities I would face as a result, and rather than wait until, well, who knows when, they decided to combine it with the sex talk. But none of this was that big of a surprise to me. While it hurt to know how differently I'd be treated because of parts of myself I couldn't control, unfortunately, my parents hadn't even gotten to the real point of this talk: education, or more specifically, the abundant need for it. To my parents, exceeding was the bare minimum that I had to do in order to succeed in the world. The comparative lack of additional resources available to me because of my race and gender would only add to the steep competition I would face, and the only way to even the playing field would be in education. College wasn't a question or something to think about, it was a requirement. The question wasn't if I wanted to go to college, it was which one to go to. My parents made it very clear they didn't care how far away I had to go for a degree, as long as I got one. To them, as black people who struggled to find their footing without degrees, they felt the only way to avoid the struggle was a degree. Any degree would do, and it didn't matter what field I went into as long as I had one. So, from the ripe age of 12, I was put on the path towards a college education and financial freedom before I even knew what college was. My childhood ended with that talk, and my adulthood began, a life of independence and nothing short of excellence. It was no longer enough to succeed, I had to excel. Still, with all this prep for the next stages of my life, I never got the chance to actually think for myself and what I wanted my life to look like. I had no idea what I wanted to do or what I was interested in, only that I wanted a career making at least 70K a year. I had to be able to take care of my family as well, after all, since they put in so much effort to raise me right and get me to where I needed to be. So my potential major revolved around how much money I can make rather than how much satisfied it could make me. I had interest, sure, but my interest wouldn't pay the bills. At least according to my parents and schools, it seemed. So why take an art class where you can do computer science instead? And why focus on writing games where you can learn to code them and earn so much more? And so, with no time to waste exploring careers or my own interest, I applied for schools based on coding, a seemingly lucrative career that anyone could do, degree or no degree. While I had no joy in coding and found it extremely difficult, surely I could become proficient and comfortable with it after a few coding classes, much less 20 or so over the course of 5 years at a university, right? Of course not. As I quickly learned, I was unequivocally unprepared for real computer science. The one computer science class I took at my college prep school was no more than a glorified overview of what computer science was. Plus, I chose to ignore the fact that I absolutely hated the class. Coding was boring and monotonous, where even the simplest typo could render everything useless and you'd spend more time trying to fix it than actually code. But I hadn't had the time or chance to explore anything else. To me, coding was my only option if I wanted to succeed. I enrolled in KSU as a computer game development major, which was heavily focused on coding. Despite my misgivings, the first semester of KSU flew by with no problems to speak of. I mean, sure, I immediately dropped my first computer science class because I couldn't understand anything, but I could just revisit that class next semester, right? But of course, the next semester came, and with it, more computer science. And as I read through the syllabi of these classes, contending with the idea of not only having to take these classes, but also excel in them for the next 5 years, was impossible. All my earlier confidence, all the willpower I used to make it that far, all the excuses I made for pushing through, they all crumpled away. I couldn't even imagine taking half the classes in my degree works. It read more like an obituary than an actual list of classes. How was I supposed to code professionally if I hated coding? Forget trying to enjoy coding. How was I supposed to even get hired if I was terrible, unmotivated, and frankly much slower than your average coder? I couldn't see a reality where it was possible. Quitting wasn't an option, it never had been. Quitting would mean wasting everyone's time. All their efforts to build me up would have been for nothing. And what reason would my parents have for wanting me in their lives, much less under their roof? But if I couldn't quit, what could I do? I could drop my classes, take a semester off, but then what? There was no way I could keep doing computer science. I wouldn't even pass, much less be able to get a degree in the field. Something had to change. So, while everyone was out on Thursday, the day before the drop ad period for classes ended, I made a conference call between myself and my parents. I needed an answer to my life. What was I going to do? Do I drop out? And what about my major? It obviously wasn't working for me, but did I switch it now? Do I try again next semester or take a gap year? What would I do during that gap year? I desperately needed answers, and I obviously couldn't decide on my own. So I waited for my parents to respond, with answers, with a kind word, anything. Until finally my dad responded. Push through. I thought for sure I misheard him. I tried to explain this all to him, to show him the issue was the major rather than the college itself, but he had no other advice to give. I held out hope for my mom, but likewise, she didn't have an easy answer for me. While she didn't tell me to push through, she didn't know what my next step should be. None of us knew what I was really interested in, so she left all decision making to me. As she told me, I was an adult now, and she couldn't stop me, but she wanted me to think about the future rather than focusing on the present. I knew that, but my family had been so involved in getting me to pursue and enroll in college that it felt like they were a part of the journey. I knew that, but my family had been so involved in getting me to pursue and enroll in college that it felt like they were a part of the journey, which is why I was so desperate for their advice. I didn't want to quit, nor did I intend to, but everyone was making me feel like I was. I hated feeling like a disappointment, especially so close to the finish line, but I couldn't keep going as I was. Something had to change, and I would have to depend on myself to find a solution. So, the next day, after emailing my financial and academic advisors for 2 days, I dropped my classes for the semester. And soon after, I changed my major from computer science to English. While I had wanted my family's blessing in doing all this, it was clear that ultimately these decisions regarded my future and thus were up to me. If I couldn't do computer science, what could I do? And rather than rush into a new major with no plan, why not take some time to explore and actually see what I wanted my future to look like? So that spring and summer, I spent time getting to know myself. That long, much belated period of self-discovery was a much-needed breath of fresh air from the years of constant schooling and college prep I'd been going through. And once I came back to school in the fall, I felt much more in tune with myself and my dreams than I'd ever been before. I took things slow, at my own pace, rather than trying to blaze through and push through every discomfort. Of course, not everyone agreed with my decisions. For me, it seemed to have less to do with what I did and more to do with the fact I did it on my own. But I couldn't base my life on what others wanted for me. It was the reason I got into such a dark place in the first place. Instead of doing what I wanted, I did what others wanted or expected of me and almost pigeonholed myself into a life I didn't want. Looking back, I feel that all of this could have been avoided if I had given the time to know myself. Rather than looking at careers based on security and salary, I should have been encouraged and able to explore careers based on my own interest. Even now, at almost 21 years old, I'm still trying to figure out what I want. Maybe I'll figure it out before I walk the stage. Maybe I won't figure it out until I'm 30 in a completely different career. And maybe I don't have just one thing I'm interested in. Having that time to explore and think made me realize how much I and other kids like me were made to feel like they had to figure out their entire lives and stick with a plan before they were even old enough to drive. But letting ourselves breathe and letting ourselves contemplate, change our minds, or even wait to decide aren't as bad as a lot of people, particularly parents, make it seem. If anything, I think that freedom is what allows people to feel sure in their choices, because they're given the opportunity to turn it over in their minds, explore other possibilities, and build their life for themselves before making it their reality.